we've got a really good question from Jonathan Booth in Newcastle. And it's this. He says, "Hi, Tom and Mike. I just can't get my head around covenant theology and how it disputes dispensationalism. And if there's any other major theologies to examine when reading the Bible. Internet searches and YouTube videos confuse me more. I'm hoping Tom can help me figure it out. And if it makes any difference, I'm Anglican." Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'm Anglican as well, and I get confused with debates about covenant theology and dispensationalism as well. Tom, do you have any sort of knowledge or exposure to a system of theology called dispensationalism?
Yeah, I ran into dispensationalism for the first time in my life when I got engaged to the lady who is 54 years later still my wife, because her father, my late father-in-law, was very much a dispensationalist who had a Schofield Reference Bible and had studied it intensively and knew exactly all the details about when the rapture was supposed to happen and the Jews going back to their land in 1948 and all sorts of other things. And I learnt a lot from him. He was a very devout man and a great Bible student and a good lay preacher as well, bless him. Um, but I found myself less and less likely to be convinced by the specifics of the dispensationalist worldview. And I discovered that part of the reason that he had been taught as a young man that this system was the way you had to go was that the alternative in his part of the English church when he was growing up was the movement called the British Israel movement, the idea that the British were actually the 10 lost tribes or some variation on that. And so in order to ward off British Israelitism, you had to be a dispensationalist, and that would give you a true way. And so many movements have grown up in the church by reaction against something which is perceived to be wrong. People lurch off in another direction without realizing that they're all within a larger and possibly less than perfect and less than complete system within which they're reacting. I spoke in a previous episode about the way in which the reformers were reacting against the medieval teaching, which said that in order to get to heaven, you had to go through purgatory. And they wanted to say, no, in order to get to heaven, we don't go through purgatory, not realizing that the Bible is saying it's not about our souls going to heaven, it's about God coming down to dwell with us. And so that the dwelling of God is with humans, as in Revelation 21. In other words, it's possible to have a right reaction within a wrong scheme. Now, I'm not sure that I could name to you all the different ways in which dispensationalism and covenant theology clash with one another, except to say that covenant theology traditionally goes back to a reading of the covenants that God makes with Adam, with Abraham, with David, with Moses, of course, and in some theologians with lots of other people as well. And then there's, of course, the new covenant predicted in Jeremiah 31 and then activated through Jesus. So some people see this great sequence, step by step by step, all these different covenants, which is then quite different from the dispensationalists who say that, well, Israel was supposed to react to Jesus' preaching, but they didn't. So God put the whole system on hold, and now we're waiting for the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies in a whole new way. Um, if I had to choose between those two, I would be a covenant theologian all the way down the line. Like if I had to choose between Luther and Calvin, I would choose Calvin. But I don't actually want to be pushed into that dilemma. I want to say that the Bible itself regularly challenges these schemes and systems because they're attempts by people later on to form some kind of coherent whole, but often without regard to what the biblical writers were actually talking about. And I've spent my life, and Mike, you've spent your life, trying to articulate what the New Testament itself is actually saying within its first century Judean context and addressed to the Greco-Roman world of the day. And again, when we go back to that, we find that these big floppy systems saying A plus B plus C, therefore whatever, they may catch something of the flavor of some bits, but they don't do the whole job. So going back and continually working on a full biblical theology over against those systems, I would see that as the mandatory thing. By the way, we may have mentioned it on this show before, There's a recent book by a guy called Hurrell called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. It's
Yeah.
just out not long ago, which is a splendid expose of how dispensationalism came about. It's a very odd, strange story, a very quirky, dark bit of church history. But now it seems that dispensationalism has really run its course in terms of an academic attempt to explain the Bible, and it lingers on simply like the grin on the Cheshire Cat in the form of popular movements about the rapture or the late great planet Earth or Left Behind or, heaven help us, support for the present state of Israel, whatever it wants to do, and so on. Those are really important sort of sub themes, but I would say back from all of those systems, back to, it sounds very traditional, doesn't it, back to the Bible itself, which is a much larger and more interesting book, I think, than any of those systems would allow for.
I think it was Charles Simeon who said that people can be more systematic in their approaches than the Bible itself.
Yeah,
But people
absolutely.
do want to find a way to make everything line up and be nice and neat. And covenant theology finds the unity of the Bible in various covenants, both ones mentioned and ones they postulate, whereas dispensational theology looks for that unity in the distinction between the church and Israel and focusing on the various discontinuities between the old and the new covenant. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, but I mean, trying to understand the unity of the Bible is a constant and proper preoccupation. But we all need to watch out lest we be fobbed off too quickly
Mm.
with schemes that don't reflect the way people were actually thinking and writing in the first century.
Well, thanks for your question there, Jonathan.